So, Esotericism and Liberalism 1.0. Arthur Melzer has written this fantastic book, Philosophy Between the Lines, The Lost History of Esoteric Writing. He offers a great analysis of esotericism and presentation. I'll be channeling him greatly today. So there's a basic distinction in esoteric thinking. If there's an exoteric message, the more obvious or more surface level message, and then an esoteric or less obvious message, maybe intended for a different reader. That's the basic duality of the idea. Now, this idea of obviousness, of course, is variable and dependent on context, just like Smith's idea of propriety. In different communities, different reference groups, there'd be different levels of obviousness. And of course, something that's obvious to one community might not be obvious to another community, just like propriety in Smith. And so, it could be that you're esoteric or exoteric and esoteric in this loop, that this esoteric to the more advanced reader is almost obvious to be exoteric. And then he might be able to discover a deeper esoteric. All right? And so there's actually layers, but we have at a loop level the basic distinction between exo, which is external, and eso, internal communication. Now, I think it's useful to think of knowledge as having facets: information, interpretation, and judgment. When you have just a single interpretation or a shared interpretation, a symmetric interpretation, then things get flattened down to information. It just becomes that knowledge is flattened down to information. This is very common, as we know, in economics, where people tend to think that all there is to knowledge is information and asymmetries and imperfections of information. This corresponds to the common knowledge assumption in model building. You might think of this as the univocality concept, where that gets used in Melzer's book and elsewhere, as opposed to multivocality. And ideas about asymmetric interpretation, where there's more than one, where they're disjointed between listeners or thinkers or players. We have a whole series of topics in economics. The most important one is the idea of entrepreneurial discovery, the idea that you reinterpret the world to see, not just that you get new information, but you might hit upon new interpretations that spell discovery for entrepreneurial profit. The idea of regret, I think, is inherently asymmetric interpretation. Humor, in whatever form, I think is fundamentally involves asymmetric interpretation. Giving and taking a hint, as Thomas Schelling has pointed out, going nuts, if you will, I think is kind of in this spirit. And esoteric writing. So you can kind of think of the topic of esotericism, as under some broader collection of ideas that are really about asymmetric interpretation. I mean, to people in the arts and so on, this would just be like, of course, but and this element is kind of what differentiates us from machines. At machines, you get to some highest level where there's sort of like a final interpretation. Whereas human beings, there's sort of always a higher interpretation. Everything that we do is sort of going on within some kind of tacit interpretation. We're sort of inside the whale, as it were. So that's why we think of computers as actually not particularly wise. They might be smart in a way, but we don't think of them as wise. They do what you say, not what you mean. Now, information itself has an interpretive background to it. And you might look at go back to facts, things that none of us in the conversation even care to challenge, and we'll speak to each other about those as the facts. But, the facts themselves, once you stop and think about it, are theory-laden, as people so often observe and note. And so, again, we have a kind of spiraling, no uppermost, no lowermost kind of world of knowledge. Now, back to communication. So a kid breaks a window and tells the cop or the parent on the block, wasn't me. Okay? The exoteric message is obvious. It wasn't him, he says. Is there an esoteric message here? Is this esoteric communication? I think it's useful to assimilate the idea of esotericism to simple lying, and to see simple lying as a kind of, as Melzer puts it, second cousin to the real duality of sending two messages. The teenager, in a sense, is telling himself, no, I didn't really do it. In a sense, he's winking to himself, like, don't believe what I just told the cop. Okay? So esotericism can be stretched a bit to include other cases where some kind of more personal or truthful or honest or sincere recognition would not actually accept the exoteric, even if no particular other esoteric other than, I don't mean it, is really being communicated. This comes in, as we'll see, in the different motives or purposes. So this is an outline for today. 3 types: Melzer's 4 motives or purposes, Melzer's devices and techniques, his historical claims, and then relating it to liberalism with his focus on Hume and Smith. Now, the 3 types I have here, you see, do you mean for a superior reader to embrace your exoteric message? And like in the case of the kid breaking the window, the superior auditor is like himself. And he doesn't mean to be embracing his exoteric message, okay? And so if that's a no, I want to call that winking esotericism. It's not actually, pure and that interesting, at least. It's winking. It's just kind of saying to somebody else or even yourself, I don't really mean my exoteric message. But if the answer is yes, then you have just plain talk, okay? Here, where do you aim to communicate more than winking esoteric message to a superior reader? If it's no, then we have just plain talk. If it's yes, then we have sending 2 types of messages, okay? Now, if we turn to these, we'll see how these relate to the others after we go through them. These are Melzer's 4 motives or purposes. Defensive is basically defending yourself, like in the old days from censorship and persecution. Now, this word persecution gets used quite a bit in this context, partly because of this essay and book title by Strauss. But really it's broader, okay? It could be about not being dismissed. It could be about not getting advancements and rewards. It could be about any personal repercussions. And that's all being considered defensive, okay? Then there's protective. And this is the idea that certain ideas, beliefs, truths are dangerous to people and maybe even bad for people. Now, this strikes us today as quite bizarre because we live in this wide open world of discourse where every idea is out there and there's nothing you haven't heard before, in a sense. And you'll have heard of everything I'm about to put on the screen. But you go back to this historical phenomenon, that's not the case. Right? So what are some of these dangerous beliefs circa, say, 1600, 1700, what have you? That there's no divine justice, no afterlife. A lot of people thought people would go crazy if people thought that that they just, go around committing crimes and having sex with their animals and God knows what. They weren't sure that, life could go on without that idea. That there's no providence, no God, and hence you don't actually have the love of God in your daily life or in any of your life. That you can't much affect the world. These are upsetting ideas. You can't much improve yourself or your situation. What is much? I don't know, but maybe the message is less than you think. You can't much affect your own happiness. Same kind of thing. Your hopes are unrealistic, maybe foolish. That there's this regress of validation. Who do your validators, whether it's your priest or your professor or your father or whoever, have validation, right? This kind of regress of authority, of validation, which somehow we manage to cope with and move on. If you believe in your foundations for your morality, your moral opinions, your personal meaning, your selfhood, well, are they foundations? So-called foundations of political authority, of political opinion. The idea that government authority is institutionalized initiation of coercion. That could be a very corrosive idea to political authority. Who's being protected here? Could be the inferior reader, if you want to think of an inferior and a superior reader, who's just not ready for these, right? Just like, your 5-year-old isn't ready to hear that there's no Santa Claus, right? It could also be non-readers, sort of that these ideas proliferate beyond your readers if you start putting them out there, right? Like maybe you think your reader can handle it, but it's still not a good idea to unleash this stuff on the world. It could even be your would-be superior reader in the sense that, like, hey, look, he would be capable of seeing this and becoming, as it were, a more superior reader, but I don't even want to wish that upon him. The idea of ignorance is bliss. And so, partly from this reason, we have the idea of respecting pieties, traditions, established institutions, taboos. That's a big part of the esoteric analysis. Now the third form is pedagogical. And you can think of this as the Socratic method. What does Socrates do? He doesn't spoon-feed his readers or his interlocutors. He asks them questions. He gets them thinking, right? He gets them to kind of discover. It's a pedagogical thing. And in this case, it's not so much two different people, your sort of inferior reader, Peter, and your superior reader, Paul. It's rather more the idea of improving one person through the process, converting them, cultivating, educating, edifying, as opposed, again, to spoon-feeding. Okay? And how do you do this? You make them puzzle. You make them work for it. And so on. And I think it's much more pertinent for great thinkers. By the way, this whole topic is very often kind of more about prominent speakers or writers. It's not necessarily about every person communicating or writing something down. Anyhow, so the fourth is political. This is Melzer's terminology. And it's to propagate or advance political goals, policy reforms. But it could be any kind of institutional reform, really. He's kind of lumping all that under political. So if you aim to, reform the church or reform some other institution, that's not exactly governmental. It's still being lumped under political. So this specifies a motive wider than reforming the reader's thinking, or maybe more specific. And I do think a salient type here of esotericism is winking. I mean, these guys sell their political ideals and goals without necessarily even believing their own BS, right? There's a ton of that, of course. I mean, that's kind of what we think of political speech as principally consisting of. Now, we see that all the time in policy discourse. You could push it back to something more like deeper. And here, let me suggest that I tend to read Locke as actually kind of doing this with social contract, not just Locke. And that is, he lived in an age of political instability. It's like a stable polity was still sort of an aspiration, really. And I see him sort of invoking the status of contract to go one way or the other in the political situation. His way was, of course, to sort of justify a change, right? Those overlords have broken the contract, and that justifies our resistance or change, and so on. And that, of course, was also the theme of the American independence. It could go the other way. That is to say that someone, and perhaps Grotius and Pufendorf fit this, that they invoke social contract to get people to accept their side of the contract. Like, hey, put up with it. You signed on to this. Okay? And so maybe in a world without stable polity, this was a good move. I'm not sure that, John Locke was being consciously esoteric in all this, or politically esoteric. But I think it's an interesting idea. It's a suggestion. But as I say, we see it on a policy level and basic, partisan politics level all the time. Part of the insidious and crafty art of politics. Okay? And you could perhaps relate it to protective in the sense that maybe you justify promoting your policy with this propaganda because otherwise the policies will be different and that'll be bad for people. So in a way you're protecting them from worse policies. So it could kind of be related. And so you can put the four into the different, in the three different types. And I think, basically these three can be all three different types. It can be winking. It can be type 1 here, where my exoteric message is something for you to believe, but there's also an esoteric. Okay? And it could be here, my exoteric is not something to be believed, but I do have an esoteric message for you. This classic case here would be someone teaching agnosticism when they're announcing theism, when they're apparently promoting theism. The other thing to notice here is that pedagogical is only down here, because pedagogical necessarily involves teaching an esoteric message. Okay. So let's turn to devices and techniques. There's tons. And this is for in particular types 1 and 2 here, not type 0, where there's also an esoteric message to be put across or being put across. Now this is a natural dilemma. This is I'm cribbing this directly from Melzer. If the idea is that it's not to be obvious, either because you don't want your inferior reader to see it, you don't want your censor to see it, or because you want to make your pupil work for it, the thing is you can't make it too non-obvious, because you can't make it impossible either. So it's a tension there, kind of a dilemma. It can't be a simple code, kind of like a decoder ring, so that once you get the decoder ring, you can just, figure things out quickly, because then anyone who gets the code is basically seeing the message clearly. It's no longer non-obvious. So that said, think about this as a general statement. This could be the author reporting that J says X about Y, or it could be the author himself saying X about Y. Okay? And the idea here is that all three of these pieces can be reinterpreted to look to see the devices. So from the mouth of the author J, well, if J is the author, think about it. Most stuff was anonymous before sometime in the 18th century. That just shows you how, it was open to interpretation from the start. You don't even know who's saying it and if he's really committing himself to it. He could be saying something else. J could be a disputant. Either someone the author is disputing or a disputant that's talking to another person in a dialogue, as in his works, right? It could be a buffoon, a beggar, a drunkard, an idiot. Okay? And these could be beards or masks for the author. Now let's think about reinterpreting why. So this is sort of the target of commentary. Well, Melzer has the idea of dissembling the true target. He says it's Y, but maybe it's really Z. And so fables, histories, allegories, it could, be about this when really it's about commentary and society. It could say that, as Melzer gives an example, a history of medieval or Renaissance Venice when really it's a commentary about their regime today and the abuses and so on. I think we see this in TMS. Some of you have maybe heard me talk about this. Smith speaks of the horrible practice he has just now mentioned, and the one he had just then mentioned was infanticide, but just a couple pages later he talked about, a much more relevant practice, particular usage, and I think more uniformly unacceptable slave trade, because he even said that this time that sometimes could be excused. And I think that the most important or most powerful sentences in Wealth of Inferior Moral Sentiments are actually those. So I think that when he says the horrible practice I have just mentioned, I think he perhaps wants you to think of this one. He also speaks of honoring a promise to a highwayman, and I suggest that he might be actually talking about complying with government rules there. He attacks casuistry, and based on where it's placed and other considerations, I think he might be attacking sort of like the interventionist state, which has certain analogous features to what he says about casuistry. So now let's turn to X and think, he's saying X about it, but what about maybe as opposed to S, or S stands out as a possible alternative? Well, maybe the author argues against S, provoking thoughts about it, even though he doesn't say he's in affirming it. Maybe even developing a compelling case for S, and then taking it back, like developing this compelling case and then saying, but of course we know this is an unsound thing. Maybe defending X lamely, which is what I see Smith doing on usury. Another thing is dispersal, that dispersing argumentation for S, the alternative point of view or contrary point of view throughout the text. Not that Smith so much denies some other or affirms some other X, but in TMS I see him dispersing an awful lot through the text against the governmentalization of social affairs without pulling it together and announcing that as a major theme. Many other techniques and devices: textual incongruity, such as departing from a declared plan; conspicuous inconsistency or self-contradiction; commission of errors that an author with such competence and mastery would know not to make; intentional unclarity, expressing esoteric message in language that is obscure, vague, or terse. We've been reading some Montesquieu in the reading group lately, and I think Montesquieu is a good case of this. Very terse expression, and you don't know how to unpack it, and it's quite paradoxical. Expressing very striking or intense thoughts in an oblique or ancillary fashion, such as in a meandering discretion or in footnotes. And again, I see Smith's slave trade remarks, the way they come and where they come and how he just kind of moves on as though it never happened, as perhaps fitting into this. Meaningful silence or conspicuous omission when you would expect something. I think it's quite remarkable that Smith's quite comprehensive review of significant public policy in his society doesn't ever say anything, doesn't ever weigh in on the poor law. Alluding subtly to the writings or opinions of a significant figure, even stories and fables. This isn't going to work. I got to keep my coat on. I'm getting a little bored, but I don't want to monkey with the microphone. Okay. Saying something using familiar terms that sounds like conventional thought, but then quietly twisting the semantic content of the terms used, which then would kind of have ramifications through the whole conventional thought. Placing thoughts of particular significance in the middle of the text or in the exact center of a list or sequence. Melzer talks about David's knife in The Prince. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but yeah, so first of all, David didn't have a knife. And this is the second time that Machiavelli says something bizarre and inaccurate with respect to David, because he also does it in the discourses, as Melzer points out. Furthermore, this occurs truly quite exactly in the middle of the Prince's text, especially if you take away the short preface or dedication. I mean, like within a dozen words from the original, I think it's Italian, but also in the English translation. Smith notices this middle idea when in the lectures on rhetoric and belles letters. Thucydides, on the other hand, often expresses all that he labors so much in a word or two, sometimes placed in the middle of the narration, but in such a manner as not in the least to confound it. And he was really big on Thucydides. It's clear. He says so repeatedly in the lectures. And meanwhile, notice that in the first edition, the invisible hand comes quite precisely in the middle, also quite precisely in the middle of the sixth edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. This drafted for all editions, and so this was the first edition of the of Wealth of Nations. This is the last edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. This 6 gram, led by an invisible hand too, right dead center here, right dead center here. Was this on purpose? Maybe. By the way, if we look at his first publications, we see irony at least. He reviews Samuel Johnson's dictionary, and he complains that he collects a whole bunch of illustrations of the word in use, Johnson does, but without sorting out which meaning the quotations illustrate. And Smith, just to illustrate how he thinks the dictionary should be done, he does this word and this word. And then at the end of the review, he says, anyhow, this is a great contribution, and people who have any trouble figuring out meanings will have no difficulty but by consulting his dictionary. And if there's 2 meanings of but there. It could be like, you'll have no difficulty unless you consult his dictionary. But, you know, the exoteric was by virtue of consulting his dictionary. So it was very clear. And he had something with Johnson for some reason. They didn't like each other. Maybe that was one reason. Anyway, and then a year later, he has this letter on literature which dwells on Rousseau, and he praises Rousseau's dedication to Geneva, and I think that's satirical. I think it's quite clear that that's satirical. And a big part of the whole piece. Okay, let's turn to the historical claims in Melzer. Now, just to kind of step back a second, thinking historically, first, you've got to realize, first of all, that when you speak, there's a discourse context, okay, or a discourse situation. And that writing things down as opposed to speaking relinquishes much control over your own words. You're sort of committing things to paper, which you're not necessarily doing when you speak, and particularly in the age before video recording and all that. In fact, it was said of Smith that in his class, in his lecturing, he hated scribblers, people who wrote down what he was saying. And bear in mind that maybe this is one reason we have some important figures who never wrote anything, like Socrates, like Jesus. Plato, except for the letters, put everything into other people's mouths. It was all dialogues, except you might say the titles of his works. And again, anonymity was the norm until something like the mid-18th century. Okay. So, historical claims. So, first think of philosophy before the printing press. Who's hearing this? Who's reading this? Who are you speaking to? It's not a lot of people. Okay, it's very different than our world today. It's, you could say, elites of different kinds. Whether they are elite students or political elites and so on, religious elites and so on. And Melzer argues and shows, I think quite convincingly, that virtually all great writers up through the early modern period practiced and even wrote about or acknowledged or admitted, in a sense, esotericism. All right, so we get the printing press. When speech becomes, or discourse becomes more complicated, again, you're like committing things to paper. This gives rise, you could say, to the Reformation, the ability for someone to think, hey, I'm going to secede from the Catholic Church by printing up this other way of seeing things and distributing it to everybody. In a way, that's a way to think about Luther. And this led to chaos and wars of religion. Meanwhile, there's falling costs of printing, mass readership increasingly. A growth in literacy, partly because of an emphasis on reading the Bible in certain places. And there's liberalization of the press in some places and gradually. And increasing religious toleration, after they kind of saw what a mess this was, in the later part of the 17th century. Ideas of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and speech. The very emergence of public opinion. Like we take that for granted, but this is like forming in you could say in the 17th, 18th century. I mean, also science and enlightenment, this whole kind of programmatic idea of getting ideas out there, exploring ideas, testing ideas, experimenting, communicating, teaching, uplifting, enlightening. The rise of the nation state. So how do we manage a nation state? How do we do republicanism in an extended territory? You need public opinion for that. You need this. I mean, this is all part of it and part of the context. And meanwhile, liberalism is shifting the focus of government, or at least calling for government to focus on lower things, protecting people against injustice, rather than tending and leading the higher things, the spiritual, the meaningful things in society. So this is sort of a background And he says that there was a very lively discussion about esotericism in the 18th century. I think he demonstrates this convincingly. The more that I've thought about this and read stuff from the 18th century, the more I think he's absolutely right. I basically agree with all of Melzer's historical claims. I think it's one of those things where, 30 years ago, people would have denied these claims, but all of a sudden it's like everyone's like, oh, we all knew that. We already knew that kind of thing. He's got a wonderful appendix of testimony. This is testimony of showing quotes from people, not just, it's not about them being esoteric. It's about them acknowledging esotericism, about admitting or affirming esotericism in their own writing or in someone else's writing or as just a pervasive practice. And so it's just overwhelming, really, and it's growing. He welcomes more. I communicated with him, and he welcomes more if you find things that are not, you can go here, if you find things that are not already in his compendium. I've sent him a number of things. And then I think of 1800 as an important marker year, really, when esotericism recedes, and recedes rapidly. And furthermore, there's a forgetting. Not only do they stop being esoteric, but there's a rapid forgetting that they had been, which is pretty remarkable and almost bizarre. This is a 1811 letter from Goethe to a friend of his, speaking of the act of forgetting taking place before his very eyes. Goethe says, I have always considered it an evil, indeed a disaster, which in the second half of the previous century gained more and more ground, that one no longer drew a distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric. So this little quotation, it both reports that it's happening, it reports that he thinks it's a disaster. And it's not only that people are stopping practicing esoteric writing, but they're forgetting. Well, I guess he doesn't specifically say forgetting, but if they're looking back on previous writers and they're not drawing the distinction, I'd say they're forgetting. So after this, there's this increasing forgetting and blindness, even a blindness to it, which Melzer explains impoverishes their interpretations of older texts. And if you bring this forward, maybe it's later in the 19th century and then in the 20th century, what Melzer suggests is that basically you got a lot of people accepting the exoteric too much. And this is his argument. I don't know that this is a very accurate overall assessment, but he says that what you see then is people looking back and seeing that writers are very much the product of their age, that their values, their teachings are very much along the lines of established thought, conventional thought of their age, right? But that could be that reading or perception or impression could be because these interpreters don't only see the exoteric and they don't see all the esoteric, where throughout the ages, actually, great thinkers have actually been dissenting, but subtly, right, between the lines. And it's kind of a neat idea because it kind of suggests that sort of, through the ages, there's sort of this kind of thinking and mind that is trying to bust through but can't really come out and say it, which I think is kind of a cool idea. And so it also leads to faulty interpretations of those people, of course. And then the next part of the story, so to speak, is a kind of rediscovery by him, expanding and expounding on past esotericism. That's all part of a kind of larger Straussian take on things, you could say. I mean, Strauss is a guy who's got his worldview and his opinions, like any thinker, and so it's really integrated into a broader view. I'm not altogether crazy with a lot of the core aspects of this. I sometimes speak of this as the Straussian baggage that comes along with esotericism in the Strauss world. Straussians themselves are very divided on different things, but there's some commonality, of course. And another part of the history is the hostility to Strauss and his claims about esotericism, the neglect. Nonetheless, a network of pupils and colleagues. So just to say, there's so much great about this book, and I've touched on some of the primary things, but there are other things as well. I just thought he's exploring the blindness to esotericism is extremely rich and penetrating, kind of like the psychology of the blindness to esotericism, why esotericism is so offensive to people, so off-putting to people, and explaining that hostility to the people who maintain its existence. He also has a great discussion of the abuse of esoteric reading, the opportunistic indulgence that esoteric reading might open up, and how to be cautious about that. And then there's quite a bit in the book about the larger Straussian worldview. Okay, so on to Liberalism 1.0 in connection with all of this stuff. I've purported some esoteric moments in Smith already. I think esotericism is frequent and important in TMS. In a way, less so in The Wealth of Nations. These two guys, contemporaries of Smith, both intimated or indicated that Smith himself soft-pedaled classical liberal ideas or fudged them on one matter or another. For Hume, too, I think it's very important, really quite important, the whole esotericism. Here's one passage from Hume remarking on esotericism. A man has but a bad grace who delivers a theory, however true, which he must confess leads to a practice dangerous and pernicious. Why rake into those corners of nature which spread a nuisance all around? Truths which are pernicious to society, if any such there be, will yield to errors which are salutary and advantageous. So he himself is sort of saying, hey, sometimes there's cause to be esoteric or to be protective and so on. In Smith, we see discussions in a way of esotericism. There's certainly quite a bit about strategic writing in the lectures on rhetoric. In the astronomy, for example, he suggests esotericism on the part of some of the astronomers that he's reviewing, defensive esotericism in particular. In TMS, there's discussion of political esotericism, about faction leaders not really believing their own PR, their own press, and so on. There's a bit of that. He talks about wise moderation, Salon. Also stuff about frankness, concealment, reserve. There's a letter he got that's very explicit about esotericism from this fellow. I'll get to it in a minute. He does have a long footnote in this work where he actually pushes against, at least exoterically, he pushes against an esoteric reading of the Neoplatonists. Not of the Neoplatonists, by the Neoplatonists of Plato. That's rather interesting, and I don't know what to make of it. I think a useful idea here is contrarieties. Paradoxes. Paradoxes in the text. Hey, it said this here, but it said that there. They seem contrary. They're not contradictions necessarily. It's more like a kind of pale of contrariety. And I love this quote by Livingston, who came and spoke here last year, a Hume scholar. Philosophical insight is gained by working through the contrarieties of thought which structure a drama of inquiry. And he had Hume, the treatise, in mind in particular. But it's the idea that the author is actually leading you through a drama that is developing these contrarieties, and then it's up for you to sort them out, figure out how the apparently inconsistent statements fit together. Generally speaking, I think the solution is that all of the above are true, but you've got to see how they are interrelate and are nested and so on. And this is the big one in the treatise, as Eric has written about. Both guys have, I think, contrarieties going on this. I think this is a very big matter of contrariety in Smith. I think both have it going on this, perhaps more especially in Hume, because I think Smith's idea of liberty as others not messing with your stuff becomes rather clear. I think this is very much kind of a deliberate contrariety in Smith, in TMS. All right, well, why would they be esoteric? It's pretty obvious we kind of have this intuitive understanding about why people would be about religion. But what about philosophy, epistemology, its certainty, its generality, its supposed foundations? What about morality, its flavor? For example, Hume withheld his essay on suicide as a kind of particular moral judgment, because he kind of said, it's not necessarily wrong all the time. Again, morality, its certainty, its generality, its supposed foundations. This goes back to the whole idea of the regress of validation. What about politics? Again, its flavor, like the presumption of liberty, could be upsetting, challenging, threatening. Its certainty, its generality, its supposed foundations. So this is that letter that Smith got in 1788. Pontonamore sent Smith a work that he'd recently published, which soft-pedaled the free trade liberalization message and conclusion. I hope you will forgive the deficiencies of my work that are not unknown to me, and some of which were voluntarily committed. I think I misspelled that. It is more important to do well than to say well. If, speaking as a government official, we announce to our traders, to our producers, to the cream of our civil administrators that it is useless and dangerous to give specific encouragement to firms and the export of their products, we would neither be read nor heard, but in addition we would risk having sound principles denounced and estranged from the government itself, and we would prolong by a decade ignorance and its deadly effects. By assaulting their eyes with bright light, we would reconstitute their blindness. So he's being very explicit about being politically esoteric. But it could also, and then Condorcet is quoted by Melzer, wrote of thinkers covering the truth with a veil to spare eyes too weak, and leaving others the pleasure of divining it, and seeming not to want more than a semi-tolerance in religion and a semi-liberty in politics. And this semi and soft pedaling you could think of in terms of the distinction between challengers and bargainers, or challenging and bargaining, where what you do, let's say you tend to favor actually these beliefs to the left, the more liberal or libertarian beliefs, but you may be carrying on a conversation about sort of this little branch here and say, this is better than that. Let's not raise the minimum wage, right? Without weighing in on the more root or radical issue of should there be a minimum wage at all, right? And so when you argue for this over that, you believe it, you mean it, this could be that type 1 esotericism. you believe it and mean it, but you could also be kind of saying, hey, look, doesn't my reasoning apply also to this? And therefore we should actually abolish the minimum wage. So you can think of bargainers as a kind of esoteric communication. And these ideas of liberalization certainly do have enemies and create alarm. It is impossible to understand the history of economic thought if one does not pay attention to the fact that economics as such is a challenge to the conceit of those in power. Hayek, the conceit, the fatal conceit, said very similar things, that these liberal ideas might offend and embarrass the pretense of knowledge, that expertise in many fields is really a sham. That's a kind of political opposition. It could be an intellectual opposition. And then, of course, there's all sorts of business and merchant and established institutions opposition. More generally, people might see frightening gateways in liberalism. That liberalism throws things open to the unknown, to immorality, to dissent, to upheaval, to turmoil, to the gangrena, which Thomas Edwards wrote about and documented and cataloged when things got thrown open under Cromwell. All these different sects and weirdos and frightening developments. Throwing people on decision-making, leaving the burden of decision-making to themselves. Like the government's not going to tell you which drug to take. You actually have to decide and be responsible. Where will the liberty principle end? People will wonder. And this kind of gets at the general instinct for social cohesion that people have and want. I personally think it comes from our genes. And I think that kind of fits Smith's four-stage theory, where he sees early society as hunters, small bands, small democratic bands, the longest period of human history, he says, as hunters, and then only laterally developing into shepherds, agriculture, and commerce, which have to, of course, develop ways of acting and living very different. And, I think he saw it very clearly all over, but for example, in Rousseau, where it's very powerfully articulated, this yearning for social cohesion and objection, downright objection to commercial society and liberalism. And, we kind of know how this played out. I mean, we kind of saw the story go. And works like Karl Polanyi's expressed, I think, quite well some of the major dissatisfactions with the liberal experience, such as it was or has been. He spoke of the first transformation of growing commerce, industry, and so on, the dislocation caused by such devices in factories and so on, must disjoint man's relationships and threaten his natural habitat with annihilation. It's upsetting ways of life, common ways of life that is, I think, natural to man. The cause of the degradation is the disintegration of the cultural environment of the victim. The immediate cause of his undoing lies in the lethal injury to the institutions in which his social existence is embodied. The result is loss of self-respect and standards. Now, we Smithians, who see everything as propriety and rules, can kind of see exactly what he's talking about when he says this kind of undoing of standards. Also, in econ, and this is topics that Dylan is working on, both this one and the next one, he seems to downplay, he does downplay, innovation, entrepreneurship, creative destruction, not much on the surface, but below the surface, I think I think you can make a good case. I think Dylan is making a good case. Not that he's entirely the first, but you're taking the lead or whatever. That below the surface, he sees that these things are very much concomitants of liberalism, liberal policy, commercial society. He just doesn't want to alarm people. He doesn't want to play them up. Now, of course, he's writing before the real blade of the hockey stick shoots up, and you could say that he doesn't know how big factories are going to get and so on. But I think he sees stuff coming in a big way. And stuff in The Wealth of Nations, like when he talks about what is effectively kind of like the long run, the downward sloping long run supply curve, just show it. I mean, his whole attitude about improvement over time and commerce tending to improve things that I think show that he actually was aware and understood that that's where the great enrichment comes from. In TMS on morals, this again, there's very little favoring challenging of institutions, of norms, really very little, and even frowning on challenging, I would say. In fact, some say that TMS teaches conformity and paints morality as conformity, essentially. But subtly, I think there is a big message of innovation in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Again, this is something that Dylan's working on. Innovation in your man within the breast. That you are called to develop your man within the breast in your own way, to develop independent judgment. And so he's advising independence of judgment, but you can see very clearly that he's also advising discreteness and reserve throughout. Smith naturalizes commerce in some important places, and this perhaps could be thought of as esoteric efforts. Like when he says in chapter 2 of Wealth of Nations, second chapter of the book, that, what brings on the division of labor? Well, it's our propensity, this natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. I don't know. I don't generally, get struck by my propensity to truck, barter, exchange. I generally hate shopping and hate going to the store. I don't want to trade and exchange. I do it because I want to get the stuff at the store. But he makes it sound like it's more of like a natural part of man, and I think it's unnecessary for his argument, and I think it's not that believable. But then again, maybe it helps get people thinking like commerce is natural. Another thing in TMS, he says that family affection comes more from familiarity than blood. And so it's about being brought up, it's spending time together and being accustomed to each other, that habitual sympathy or affection develops. It's not about blood. And he kind of doesn't say much favorable about treating your family as that special. I think it's a little peculiar, in fact. He says in commercial, so this is as compared to pastoral societies with a more like primitive system of law, and you need clans to protect yourself. In commercial societies, descendants naturally separate and disperse as interest or inclination may direct. Another example here, perhaps, or something that relates, is how much in the basic treatment of sympathy at the beginning of the book, he doesn't describe it as copying another sentiment just kind of through contagion, but a matter of first entering into the other situation and then rediscovering the sameness. And then you find sympathy. And that again suggests that, look, don't just go along with the crowd, right? And you've got to exercise this independence and prepare yourself for this kind of impersonal world where you shouldn't necessarily fall in with everyone, and you can't fall in with every person you interact with. Now, Pocock points out that the child of jurisprudence is liberalism. Remember that jurisprudence formulated, worked out, developed this idea of commutative justice, not messing with other people's stuff, what made it theirs, what was messing, the whole jurisprudence thing. And that this clarification, I think, gave rise to the idea that, gee, if you got something without messing with other people's stuff, that's earnings, that's legit, that's okay, that's kosher. And then actually saying that's okay, you should go for that, or at least you shouldn't be ashamed of it. And we see a kind of sanctification. Some of you have seen the Weber on this and the Richard Baxter quotation, a kind of sanctification of earnings, okay? And you could think of Wealth of Nations as a kind of defense of earnings, a moral authorization of the pursuit of honest income. Deirdre speaks of this as honoring commerce. It unleashes innovation and the great enrichment. Now, there's another side, of course, to all this. This was not messing with other people's stuff. You flip that around, and it's about others not messing with your stuff. And in the political relationship, it means government not messing with your stuff. And we call that liberty. Smith calls that liberty. And now you've got not something that just kind of defends yourself from criticism, says God doesn't disapprove of you of pursuing honest income. You've got something to attack, right? People who are obstructing the pursuit of honest income. You've now got a weapon, not just to defend yourself, but to attack. This liberty principle is the weapon, right? Here's your anarcho-capitalist exhibiting his humility. That, go chop all that stuff down, right? It's very scary. It could easily be taken too far, too quickly, too frighteningly. This is one way to think again about the defense of usury by Jeremy Bentham. He, of course, attacked Adam Smith for endorsing the status quo restrictions on usury, on interest rates, a ceiling on interest rates. John Diesel's written great stuff about this in his dissertation. But he's that guy with an axe. He's really very rationalistic in all of his works. And he said, should it be my fortune? He said this to Smith in his published letter to Smith in the 1787 edition of that. Should it be my fortune to gain any advantage over you, it must be with weapons which you have taught me to wield. Chesterton said the modern world began by Bentham writing The Defense of Usury, because now this liberty principle is being used on the offensive. Right, to attack all of these long-standing institutions which are pervasive that violate the liberty principle. This quotation continues, it began with Bentham and it has ended, the modern world, he's saying, has ended after 100 years in even the vulgar newspaper opinion finding finance indefensible. So it's kind of interesting how he's sort of suggesting here, Chesterton, that some 100 years later, there's like a reversal in political attitudes. Anyway, these guys clearly don't like people with an axiom to grind. That is to say, Hume and Smith. And they, of course, criticize these things. You can kind of think of this in these terms, where Paine is more the rationalist, and Burke is more with Smith and Hume. I think he's really quite close to them ultimately. And then these principles become slogans, maybe even ill-defined slogans of political movements and causes, self-righteous and noisy and obstructive, kind of like the Wilkes and Liberty type talk and movement that so upset Hume in his later years. You can think of Rothbardians, like illustrated in this momentous book, which I really do think is an important book, as men of system. I think you can think of Smith's man of system passage as directed at this, in a sense, as well as the central planners and interventionists. These guys, I think Smith and Hume taught this, but they clearly also believed in this. And when these are in tension, as they are with liberalizing reforms, That has to be negotiated. Perhaps this tempers that, is the way to think about it. Of course, in other cases, these stand together against reforms that would reduce liberty. So, Hume, on authority and liberty in all governments, there is a perpetual intestine struggle, open or secret, between authority and liberty, and neither of them can ever absolutely prevail in the contest. A great sacrifice of liberty must necessarily be made in every government. Liberty is the perfection of civil society, but still authority must be acknowledged essential to its very existence. And in those contests which so often take place between the one and the other, the latter, on that account, challenge the preference. And I think he's saying authority comes first. And I think I think that's the way to understand him. By the way, there might be some disagreement and dispute about what Hume meant by this, but I do believe he meant what Smith meant, and I mean principally by this in an important way when he says all this. But the point is that these guys saw that liberty depends on political stability. At least it has in every case in history. Presumably it does always. He favored the integration of authority into a kind of integrated system in the polity, creating kind of the two-juror relationships, equal, and superior-inferior. Superior-inferior being the political relationship. And this relates very much to direct versus overall liberty, the idea that if you liberalize some things that actually threaten the stability of the polity, for example, you could, in an indirect way, reduce liberty, so much so that on the whole, or overall, liberty is reduced by an augmentation in a direct sense. So I think Hume kind of has this liberty idea in the heart of his political thinking, but this is again one of those contrarieties. There's all of this other stuff that's also part of his constitution of liberty, his vision of liberty politically, that tries to kind of protect and advance this as much as possible, more or less. Another issue is pro-freedom versus being pro-business. I think they were sensitive to this as well. Defending liberalization is often perceived as defending business interests and serving their interests. Here at George Mason, we're no stranger to this problem because, everybody gets money from different places, but in some cases that's somehow very discreditable. Anyway, defending pursuit of honest income is often perceived as defending acquisitiveness and advocating a life made up of just lower things and forsaking virtue. So, whatever pains these guys take, Smith and Hume, to avoid these problems, it happens. We've seen it. We know it happens. It happens in a huge way to them, unfairly, and to their followers. But I think they sense that. And he always paints merchants as conniving. He doesn't want to give anything to let them think that he's like friendly or positive or pro-business. But between the lines, I think you could find stuff that is. Like when he says that, the guys who make watches is some of the most beautiful work someone can do. But it's lost in the text. It's not in one of the quotable passages, and he's not playing it up as merchants. But anyway. So we've seen 3 types, 4 motives or purposes, many devices and techniques, several historical claims, and related it to this, and their motives in particular. So now we can finally open it up. Not too bad. Sorry. Thanks for bearing with me.